In this video, we will check how form elements in React work and what are the differences between using them in React and using them in plain HTML or plain JavaScript. For this, I will first create a project with React, and I will use npm create vite for that. So just enter it here, and then everything will be set up in a subdirectory accordingly. So go to your main directory and then enter npm create vite, and then you are asked to provide your project name. You should already have the prerequisites by now. So I just enter react-form here as a project name. And then I can select React here, of course. Could also specify Preact. It's a slightly smaller version that's a bit optimized, but we'll just say React here for now. And then we move on to Vue.js, and we won't go through the entire list here, but we'll also look at Alpine.js. And for Alpine.js, we don't need to select anything here. We can just take vanilla. But first React. So then we have to choose if we want TypeScript, and no TypeScript here. We're almost done. Then we go into the subdirectory, do npm install, and then this is also done. Now we just need to do npm run dev, but you should already know that. Now we have our localhost running at 5173, and I can open it briefly in Chrome, and then we see the example application here. So in here we don't have any form elements except for this button maybe, but we don't have a form. You want to call it a form element, that's the button, okay, but it just counts up. So you can see how to implement the state here in React. This is the first file here in React form in our project, index.html of course, and here main.js is loaded from the source directory. So it's not main.js, but main.jsx. I can open it here, and I will not explain how React exactly works. There are other courses for that, but there you have a quick look at main.jsx, where root is created for React, and then it goes into this div. Everything is rendered into this root div. But how this is exactly working, this is not important here. Here is the main component, the main React component, and this is all JSX. We will now clean it up a little bit. That means we will remove everything here first. Here is, if you're interested, the button. That's then will increase the counter if you press it, and will change the state here, the use state. So we delete everything here and then start with this empty component. And with these empty tags here, you can have multiple sub-elements here. So normally you just can have one element, but with these you can have multiple elements on the same level. Anyway, we will first work here without a form, namely only with input elements directly. We will write just input here, and then we'll see how to react to changes in this input in React, and how to write a handler for events like change or input, and then respond to them. And we'll do that in the next video. So now we continue with React and the input component we've just written here. And this is written in JSX, and you can write it almost the same way as in HTML. The only thing that works here in JSX and not in HTML is setting these curly braces, and you can then put JavaScript expressions inside them. And I've also created a state with use state, and it is called first name, and you have this first name, the value, and then set first name, which is the setter for the first name state. And I assume that you are at least familiar with the basics of React, so that you can create a component like here with this input element. So you basically just make a function and then return this JSX, which looks similar to HTML, of course, except that you can write these curly braces here and inside write JavaScript expressions. And also we have these hooks here, for example, this use state, and you get a state and you get a setter for the state. So you can use the value and the setter to change the state. And this is also what we do here in onChange. That is the function that needs to be set, and it is called whenever something changes in the input. So the change event is triggered. And where's the difference to normal HTML? So as I mentioned, onChange is the method that needs to be set to a JavaScript function here, of course, and then this is written in lower camel case, and in the HTML case it is like this, just all lowercase. And then you also get this event here in this function. So this is called E here in my case. You can also call it event if you like. We can rename it here. So now it is event. So we can use event.target.value as we did already in HTML to get the input value. So let's see how this works. I'm outputting the value here with console log. I'm also setting the state here with set first name afterwards, but we'll look into that later. First, I'll output this here with console log just, and if I enter this S here, then you can see it is output here. And we have a warning here. We'll address that in a moment, or I can maybe comment this out here for now. Then we won't have the warning, and you can see better what I want to show here. I enter a letter here, and it is immediately output here in the console. So what is special about this? This is a difference to normal HTML at event listener. OnChange is not called like in HTML when the focus leaves the input field, but it is the same as for the input event. So for each keystroke, this function is called here. The onChange is called, and it's not only on blur, so to speak. So in React, the onChange event is basically the onInput event. So it's basically the same event here. You should use onChange, and onInput you can use, but it's mainly existing for compatibility reasons. But actually, you should always use onChange here. And as I mentioned, it is then triggered for each keystroke here in this input. So every key I enter here, this onChange callback will be called. So why is it like that? It has a reason, and it is to keep the internal state, our state that we get with useState, always synchronized with the value of the input field. So we set the value here also on the input as first name, and then I can now do the set first name here also. And if I do that, the state will change, first name will change, and this render function here is called once again. And then the value is compared to the input field value. Everything is in sync here. In React, this is called a controlled input. So you want to always have value in sync with the actual value of the input element. And this is why onChange is the same as onInput and is really reacting to each change, to each keystroke in this input field. So let's now do this set first name here. And this will set the state for our state first name. And if I enter something here, we get an error here. Or rather, it looks like an error, but it's a warning actually. A component is changing an uncontrolled input to be controlled. And this is relatively important because there are controlled and uncontrolled inputs in React. That's what I have mentioned earlier. And we are obviously starting here with an uncontrolled input. And why is that? Because uncontrolled inputs have no value. So the prop value is not set. As soon as I now set first name initially to undefined, I naturally have undefined here at value, and so I have no value here. That means React then says, okay, on the first render I have no value here. That means this is an uncontrolled input, and uncontrolled also means that React does not control it as much as a controlled input, of course, and controlled input simply means I always set the state here or the value here to a state, and with onChange you change this state. So because we set the initial state to undefined here with useState, then React thinks this is an uncontrolled input field here, input element, because value is undefined at first. And then React is not doing anything to it, and this is just then a normal HTML input element not controlled by React. And you can later then, for example, if the focus changes here, you can read the value from the input and then use that value. So you don't have to keep track in an internal state. So you don't have to use controlled inputs in React. You can also use uncontrolled, and then you don't set value. and not setting it is the same as setting value to undefined. So how do we fix this warning here? It's very simple. We have to set an initial state that is not undefined. So for example, an empty string here, and then we don't get this warning anymore. You need to be careful. If you actually want it like this with controlled, then you should always set value to something that is not undefined at first. So every time during rendering, this must not be undefined. Specifically, it cannot change from undefined to something defined. So if you want a controlled input, then always set the initial state to something not undefined. Or if you don't want a controlled input, then just don't set the value prop here on the input. So then you can get the value on other events, for example, form submit, then you can get the value directly from the HTML input element, and you don't have to make it a controlled input then. So now we want to output the input text here somewhere else in this output element, and I haven't covered that yet. It's also an HTML element, mainly there for semantic reasons. And inside, I just put the value here in curly braces, the first name state. And then we can see everything that is input here is immediately output also in this output element. So it is synchronized, so to speak. So this is how controlled inputs work. And I can show now what it looks like if I wrap this in a form. I can simply do that here, for example, form, and then can set the action to something, but I can also leave it for now and only set method to get. Of course, we will still need the closing tag here at the bottom. So now, for example, I just remove a value. I could also remove this on change. We will ignore the error message for now because we haven't reloaded here. And then I need to set name to first name so that it works during form submission. Reload, and now I just enter it here and I get no errors, of course. And I also get no output because I haven't set the state accordingly. And now if I press return, then, oh, okay. So the action is set here because it was auto-completed. Just remove that. And now again, enter my name and return. And then we see nothing happens here at first because this data was transmitted, but the page was reloaded. And we can have a look at the search params here in the network tab. And this is normal behavior. We see query string parameters, first name, Stefan, just like it is in normal HTML. So here at first, no difference because I don't update the state. So set first name is never called. Now I can do on submit on the form, and then these curly braces, and again, a function, an event handler here. And we get this event with E. And then we can do prevent default, which prevents the form submission, of course. And then I can use set first name, our setter, with e.target.firstname.value. So this is another way to get the form data. So just the form element and then dot and then the name of the form input. So now let's test it. I'm reloading and then enter Stefan again. So this seems to work. If I submit the form, then this will be updated here. And I did the prevent default here, of course, because otherwise the page would reload and then I couldn't output it here in my React component. So, and as I said, this is a nice way to get also all form values here with a e.target dot and then the name of the input. So I can access all the names here on the form element. That means if I make a second input here and simply call it last name, then I can do it a bit differently here. Just set name here. You can simply call it name. And we take the two values here, the first name and the last name, and put a space in between. And then we have the name, the full name. We can then put the full name here into output. And then we also make a button here, submit button. And then let's enter now first name, last name. And in this case, these two inputs are uncontrolled because I don't set value here and I don't have an on change handler. And if I now hit submit, I get the full name here down in output. This is always displayed if I submit the form here with submit or with return. And this is a bit poorly formatted here in terms of layout. We can set style here. Style is set with an object. So you can't use a string here, you have to use an object inside the curly braces. And I will do display flex here, for example. Let's rearrange that a bit here so that we get a nicer layout here. Just do like that. First name, last name. And then we have the full name below each time I click on submit. And this is how you use uncontrolled inputs here. So we are reacting on submit here on the form submit event. And then we read out the values here and concatenate first name and last name and put it in this output here below. Can also do the whole thing with controlled inputs, of course, with state. So you have to set value respectively, and with on change, then set or update the state. It's a bit simpler with this uncontrolled inputs, but of course, if you want to use the value directly or want to check the value directly, then you would better use a controlled input here or controlled inputs and use the state to track the values there. And then, of course, you have to handle on change and set the value prop on the inputs. So that's it for now for the input elements in React. We will briefly touch on select in the next video. It's a bit different, but it's almost treated the same way as an input here in React. Of course, there's much more that is possible. Basically, you can use everything that normally works in HTML. There are a few special features which I have already mentioned. For example, the onChange event is the same as onInput in React, but that's intentional. I explained why. It has to do with the states and the synchronizing of the states with the input values. You have to do it this way for controlled inputs.